One of the most important parts of a well-developed game is often something that goes unnoticed by the average player when it's implemented correctly. What is that invisible glue that holds game states together regardless of power, art, or game quality? Card text, and more specifically, ruling text. In this video, I'd like to go over a couple major points to consider for any new game developer. I'll do my best to give examples and even show a little bit of my own work, where memory lapses arise. So let's get started with the basics. Game language should be standardized. This means not referring to zones as generic terms like over there or here, but by in-game defined areas like deck or hand, graveyard, cemetery, magic and trap zone, monster zone, bench, removed area, exile, etc. Players and game designers alike need to be able to talk about these zones clearly and concisely. We need to be able to understand who is in control of said zone when it is being referred to. Using phrases with common syntax and vocabulary that is easily understood and referenced and that can be manipulated is very important for ensuring smooth, comprehensible gameplay. Your opponent's graveyard, your graveyard, all graveyards, they have very different meanings. This aspect creates an easily understood guideline of how text will happen in a game, where things will occur, and removes any confusion as to what cards are doing. Another thing to consider is, will you use numerical values like the numbers 1, 2, and 3? Will you use written numbers 1, 2, and 3? Will you draw one card? Will you draw one card? Will you draw a card? Consistency is king. There's not one answer that's better than another, as long as you keep doing the same thing each time. Next up, let's look at text that does things in-game. To start, we'll look at something akin to Magic the Gathering's triggered abilities in a couple of different games' contexts. So in this first card, Alaborn Cavalier, we see the text, "Whenever Alaborn Cavalier attacks, you may tap target creature." A couple of choices had to be made here in terms of writing. First, when versus whenever. Is there a difference? Should there be? Second, this card versus Alaborn Cavalier. Do cards reference their own name, or do they reference themselves as a unique card? And third, using a comma or an arrow or any other type of symbol to denote the triggering action versus what comes after, to speak nothing of a card's actual effect or ability in terms of gameplay, but strictly to focus on the language and terminology used. We can see that Magic the Gathering tends to go with a more standardized, easily typable form of ruling language. Typically, words like when or whenever denote a triggered ability. This means that as some action in-game is performed, some ability text on the card will possibly happen. The card is, in effect, triggered. So, now this type of action happens in other games as well. Here in Tenshoku, for example, I've used slightly different structure, but let's apply the same questions as above. First question, I use whenever. The second question, this card is used as a reference to the card itself. And third, a double arrow symbol is used rather than a comma. Now, the card is equally as understandable as the first, but the visual presentation is a bit different. As I created this card, I can speak to why I chose what I did. For the first question, in Tenshoku, I have differentiated the usage of when and whenever. When is typically reserved for actions that happen once, or very infrequently, such as when this card is removed from the game. Whenever I tend to use with actions that can happen multiple times in a single turn, or that just happen often in general. A bit arbitrary, and honestly something I might consider changing in the future, but as it stands, it's not too much of a hassle right now. Next up, as the second option, I prefer to have cards refer to themselves as this card, as then there isn't as much confusion about whether named cards applying to other cards with the same name and so forth. When a card refers to this card, it simply means this card in play right now. If it changes zone, then it would no longer be this card for some movement options. So I think that is some saved space in terms of writing out card names, and the clarity is nice, especially when there are duplicates. Finally, the last option is a choice I made purely out of aesthetic reasons. I think the arrows are pretty and visual and easy to explain. In Tenshoku, if you see the double arrows, it means this is going to be a triggered effect, and thus any cards that affect or interact with triggered effects can easily be seen relating to these effects. Obviously, Magic the Gathering's comma is just as easy to understand when in combination with the proper syntax. I personally felt like the symbol was even easier. In your game, consider what type of effects cards will have, and choose the proper language and symbols to adequately represent what you want players to do with their cards. Remember, you're not trying to confuse them, you're trying to make it easy to understand what everything does. Next up, let's move to something that we can call activated abilities or activate abilities. Various games have a myriad of ways to explain this type of effect, but typically, if we consider triggered abilities or effects as the things that react to some type of action happening, activated abilities are the things that we, as the user, the player, or the designer, caused things to happen. Typically by declaring the use of or paying a cost of some type to perform some action. Let's start again with Magic, and then we'll spread out into other games. So here we see Arcanus the Omnipotent. We have a tap ability with a colon, and then followed by draw 3 cards. As a player, we then interpret this via a couple things here. So first, I have to know what the tap symbol means, but as that would be something that would be located in a rule book, any type of symbol effect, generally we can correlate to some rule information. Now, we see here, I know I have to turn my card, tap it rather, and then the colon tells us that if everything to the left of this card has been done, or paid in a sense, you may now perform the action to the right. In this case, I tap my card, then the game puts my ability of drawing 3 cards onto the stack in Magic the Gathering, in which my opponent will now have the chance to respond. Understanding this dynamic is incredibly important to games in which there will be counterplay that involves reacting to the effects you have on your game's version of a stack or a chain. Yu-Gi-Oh! Uses a chain which resolves differently than Magic the Gathering stack, so it's important to decide how things will react so that your designers or you can understand how cards will play with each other. By including costs that involve certain effects, you can make certain actions unreactable and vice versa, putting them as an effect rather than as a cost. You can manipulate how certain actions are carried out and how other effects and abilities can interact. Now, before I get to an example of this specifically, I just want to point out as well that understanding how a turn will play out, what actions can be done simultaneously or not, are things that are important to consider. Again, let's look at Arcanus here for just a little bit longer, and notice he has a tap effect. His secondary activated effect does not have a tap, but rather a cost. When we see these things combined, we as a player or a designer need to understand that, yes, I can tap to draw my cards, and at any point I can still return Arcanus to my hand. So understanding that having 2 tap effects might limit what use a card can do. Obviously, a card typically can only tap once per turn. Now, this changes in different games, so just to be clear, but in Magic the Gathering, having different types of activated effects allows us to make more decisions for a player. So moving on, let's look at a Tenshoku example to go a little bit more into that unreactable design space. Here we see Maiden of Love. Now let's highlight the second effect here. Rest, banish this card. Search for Queen of Paradise and put it into play. Activate this effect only during your main phase. Now, astute watchers may notice that this card is worded slightly different than one might expect. Typically, we might expect to see something like rest, banish this card, search for Queen of Paradise and put it into play. Activate this effect only during your main phase. That small difference actually has a large amount of play change, given how effects are handled versus costs. By the banish effect being part of the result of the effect, it means that in response to the activated effect entering the stack, so to speak, I could use another effect to instantly banish the card, providing additional advantage. Understanding wording and placement, costs, and ability markers can greatly change the power level of certain cards in your game, so be sure to consider how strong or weak something is in terms of the overall gameplay. Just as a side note, typically games have cards sacrifice themselves as part of a cost as a way to prevent shenanigans with instant speed, either untapping or multiple effects happening at the same time. However, some things aren't always that way. Another great example is Sensei's Divining Top, where we are able to, if we can untap it, we can draw multiple times. Now, that isn't to say that all games are even worded the same as Tenshoku, Force of Will, or Magic the Gathering. Let's take a look at Yu-Gi-Oh, for example. Here is Dad, Dark Armed Dragon. It has an effect that reads the following. You can remove from play one dark monster from your graveyard to destroy one card on the field. Now, no one is claiming that Yu-Gi-Oh is the pinnacle of rules text, with God knows how many erratas, but we can see here there's no